Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War. We have finished 1862, so we're about halfway, not quite halfway in through the Civil War. So let's kind of start looking. We're going to begin 1863 today, but we're not going to really do very much military. In fact, we're not going to do any military history today. I told you when we started this, I'm not a military historian, and I want to concentrate on the people and things like that. Well, today we're going to look at some of the things that were going on besides the fighting, and there was a lot going on besides fighting. So let's kind of review what we talked about last week. We kind of finished up the year 1862 by talking about the campaigns out into the West. And we saw, first of all, that Henry Halleck had been brought back east. He had been in charge of the Western Theater. And once that spot was vacant, Lincoln decided to pull him back east and make him in charge of the whole United States Army. Primarily planning strategy. He was a desk officer. He wasn't a command officer. And so when he came east, Halleck split the division, the command of the West between U.S. Grant, who was in kind of the Tennessee, Western Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas theater, and Don Carlos Buell on the eastern side of Kentucky and Tennessee primarily. So he kind of split the West in half. So that's what we talked about last week. We also saw how Jefferson Davis made a decision to change command in the West because he had not had very good success. Albert Sidney Johnston had been his first commander, and he got killed right off the bat at the Battle of Shiloh. And so he switched to PGT Beauregard, who just made a disaster out of a couple of commands. And the result was that he said, I've had enough of him. He didn't like Beauregard anyway. So he brought him back to the east and made him a subordinate. And you don't hear a lot about Beauregard the rest of the war, although he survives the rest of the war. Instead, Davis puts in charge Braxton Bragg, which was another one of his favorites. Bragg was just an absolute disaster of a commander. In fact, Casey generally is regarded as the worst general of the Civil War. The only good thing he had going for him was that his cavalry officer was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who probably was the best cavalry officer of the Civil War. But the problem was he was just an absolutely despicable human being. He was just, I can't even describe in words how bad the guy was. He crucified POWs, he nailed them to barrels, he just on and on and on. I mean, it was just horrible what he did. And he absolutely hated blacks. In fact, Casey is the man that's generally considered to be the founder of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War during the Reformation, the Reconstruction period. We'll be talking about that a lot later. So the first thing he did was he told Braxton Bragg, we talked about this last week, head north into Kentucky and see if you can convince the Kentucky people to join the Confederacy. Well, Bragg did his typical thing. He just absolutely messed it up. It was called the Heartland Campaign. Got beat at the Battle of Perryville by a larger force. He probably shouldn't have won. But then, as a result, Buell, who beat him, refused to follow up on it and sat around and licked his wounds. And so Halleck said, hey, I'm done with that. I thought this guy would fight for me. So he replaces him with William Rosecrans, old Rosie, who, does a better job. In fact, Rosecrans has his ups and downs during the rest of the Civil War, but he is primarily a pretty good officer, as we'll find out. He ends up following Bragg south to Nashville and confronts him at a head-on battle called the Battle of Murfreesboro on the last day of the year. And, that's kind of how 1862 ends. The Union is really kind of down in the dumps because even though they've won, and I put that in quotation marks, battles like Antietam and Perryville and Murfreesboro, it doesn't seem like they're winning. They're not, really big victories. They don't get anything out of it. And the South has just continued to play this old game of as long as I don't lose, I win. And so they just kind of continue, uh, frustrating the North. The people in the North were getting frustrated along with Lincoln. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how long they wanted this thing to continue. Because remember, it's been going now almost 2 years. A lot of people have died. The whole country had been torn apart, and people were getting really frustrated. So, with that in mind, we're going to begin talking about 1863. Now, you know, as I told you, when we first started this thing, students of the Civil War really get into the military history of it. But, folks, there was so much more going on in the United States during the Civil War in terms of progress and things social, political, economic changes. One historian has said it was the Civil War's revolution. And that's kind of how I'm going to be talking about today. There was things really changing in the United States in the Civil War. And so we're going to be talking about some of those today. For instance, the Emancipation Proclamation, the changing role of women, and of course, the black population as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. The political changes that have gone on. We're going to be talking about the growth of the Republican Party because it is really becomes the dominant political party for the next 70 years. Whereas the Democratic Party became almost a regional party in the South. A couple of exceptions, but for the most part, the Democratic Party kind of becomes marginalized for the next 70 years. Uh, Economic changes. The Industrial Revolution is going on at the same time the Civil War is going on, folks. And the North is just changing rapidly into an industrialized manufacturing community. The South was stuck in the slave based agricultural economy. That's probably one of the chief reasons they lost the war. Um, New acts that were passed by Congress. Even while all this was going on, there were new acts passed by Congress, like the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, which funded land grant colleges, the Transcontinental Railroad Act, which set up, the opening of the West after the Civil War. All these things took place during the first part of the Civil War. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be talking about the Civil War as revolution. What were the changes that were going on that wasn't really anything to do with the fighting? Because that's really important. Okay, let's begin by talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Republican Party's attitude towards slaves really was made up of three different factions when the Civil War began. There were the radicals. Those are the ones that wanted outright emancipation of slaves in the nation. I mean, they said every black person ought to be free right now, no slavery at all. Of course, that's ultimately what the decision is, and the rightful decision, obviously. There were the moderates. They were opposed to slavery, but they were understandably fearful of what the consequences might be. What do you do with 3.5 million freed slaves? How do you educate them? Do are they going to flood into the cities and create areas that we can't deal with? What is going to happen if we free all the slaves? So the moderates were kind of like, we're opposed to it. We don't like it. It ought to be outlawed. But we need to think about what's going to happen when we free the slaves. And then there were the conservatives. And this is where Lincoln was at his first part of the Civil War. He eventually, comes over to the radical side. But in the beginning, the conservatives, they hoped to see abolition by states, but they also wanted to make sure that something could be done with the freed slaves. They were primarily proposed that maybe we should colonize them in other areas like Central America, Africa. Remember, the nation of Liberia has already been created as a refuge for freed slaves. And so, they were trying to figure out what to do. What are we going to do with these people once they're free? Well, as the war progressed and the abolitionists gained power, and just think about it, soldiers would come home on leave and talk about how they're confronted all these slaves that are escaping the South and how bad the situation really was. Because most people in the North really didn't have a clear understanding about how bad slavery was until they were confronted with it. And of course, as they were confronted with it, they begin to change their mind and they begin to say, hey, this is a lot worse than we thought it was. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. We need to take action. And so that's when the aims of the war begin to change from just restoring the Union to freeing the slaves. Uh, Lincoln, he went to that position, but he also understood that it had to be done at the right time. Uh, he thought about doing it the summer of 1862, but he knew that the off year elections were getting ready to take place, and he just didn't know for sure how that would go over. And so he decided, I'm going to wait until we have a big victory militarily, and then I'm going to issue an executive order freeing most of the slaves. Well, that came at the Battle of Antietam. He decided after Battle of Antietam that that was going to be his moonshot. He said, I'm gonna go for this. He already had it written. He had it written 6 months earlier, but he just had not, really had made up his mind yet when he was going to issue it. So he issues it on January the 1st, 1863. Now, what did the Emancipation Proclamation do? And this is where the confusion gets in. A lot of people just say, well, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. No, folks, it did not free all the slaves. What it did, it was issued under the War Powers Act of Article 2 of the Constitution. It freed the slaves in all states or parts of states which were in rebellion. So if a state was being ruled at that point by the Union and slavery was still allowed in that part, it continued to be allowed. So just think about it. Parts of states like Missouri, where most of the states, most of the slaves were in what was called Little Dixie up and along the Missouri River and Mississippi River Valley. Missouri was pretty much ruled by the Union in 1863. I don't know, but I have a funny feeling that there were a lot of people that remained enslaved at that point, until, slavery became the national thing, which it did not do until 1865 with the 13th Amendment. So it affected 3.5 million enslaved African Americans in the secessionist Confederate states and the border states, which were not controlled by the Union. So, there's a big difference there. You have to make sure you understand that slavery was not totally made illegal until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. This was a big step forward, obviously, but it wasn't the main step. It wasn't the big step. Now, you can imagine the reaction. On one hand, you here on this side, you see Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation. And I mean, this was obviously from the North. And I mean, they were very happy with it and proud of it. On the other hand, this is from a pro-slavery newspaper. And you can see Abraham Lincoln's a cartoon. He's got the devil holding his inkwell. He's got his foot on the Bible. And I believe it's the Bible. Maybe it's the Constitution, but I think it's probably the Bible. You've got all sorts of weird looking creatures here looking at it. You've got, somebody hauling off a white woman up here, a black man hauling off a white woman. It's, you can obviously see that there was a big, vast difference of opinion about the Emancipation Proclamation, depending on where you live. So how did this affect the blacks that were in the Union states now? Well, one way it affected them was this. Many of them began to fight in the Union Army. Now, this was, when the Civil War started, if you would have asked most white Americans in the United States, would you be accepting of blacks fighting in the army? They would have absolutely said no. Even those who were primarily abolitionists, they just, would not have accepted that at that point. Southerners obviously would have rejected it because their concept of slavery. Um, they just, even though they used slave labor in the military, they didn't use them as soldiers. Northerners refused because they felt like the war was being fought to preserve the Union in the beginning. And they didn't, they weren't exactly necessarily overwhelmingly for freeing the slaves. That would change, as we've talked about. And I'll be honest with you, if you read the accounts, they were suspicious of just whether or not they would fight. They didn't know for sure how much the blacks would fight if they were accepted into the army. I don't know why they were so scared of it, because obviously most of them would have been more than happy to fight against this Confederacy, because that was standing for slavery, and a lot of them had relatives or wives or children still enslaved in the South. The men did. So as the war dragged on, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The attitudes towards slavery changed. You begin to see a movement towards letting blacks fight in the military. Now, it was segregated. Our armed forces, you may not be aware of this, the armed forces of the United States were not integrated until 1948 in Harry S. Truman. Even during World War II, the troops were segregated into black and white units. Eventually, over 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served in the Federal Army. A fifth of a million blacks served in the Federal Army, and they did overwhelmingly good service. They did it for lower pay. They were many times given the jobs in the Army that whites did not want to do. But the ones that did engage in combat, and there were a lot of them that did, performed heroically. Specifically, two of them that I can think of is the Fort Wagner campaign, which we'll hear about later, and the Overland campaign in Virginia in 1864. So, this was a huge change in attitudes, folks. This would have just been totally unthought of prior to the Civil War. Even the Confederates, believe it or not, folks, at the end of the war had gotten so concerned about manpower because they were losing so many men and could not replace them that even the Confederate Army gave in and started having small units of black soldiers fight in the Confederate Army that were willing to. I'm sure there were many that were unwilling to, that had to fight. They had been using blacks for slave labor all through the war to begin with, digging trenches, building fortifications, loading supplies. They'd been using this. A lot of the officers in the Civil War brought their slaves with them, as their personal aides and all to help them. So, what was the first colored, and that's what it was called, the Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment, was out of Kansas. It was the first black infantry regiment, and there is a picture of them. This is a picture of a man by the name of William Carney. He won the Medal of Honor, which is, he is the first black man to win the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor in the Civil War. Let's look a little bit about William Harvey Carney, because he's an interesting man. William Carney was born a slave in Norfolk, Virginia, and during the Civil War, he escaped north on the Underground Railroad, joined his father, who had already escaped, and in March of 1863, he joined up with an infantry unit out of Massachusetts that would fight heroically during the Civil War. Some of you may have seen a movie called Glory. And Glory is a movie that talks about this Massachusetts infantry regiment. And they fought at a battle called Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina, kind of the heartbeat of the South. And there was an instance when he was in battle, in combat, that he noticed the flag had been, a fallen soldier held the flag. And despite being wounded himself, rushed over in the middle of the battle, grabbed the flag, and held on to it, even though he had suffered serious wounds himself. It's said that when he was forced to retreat, he struggled back across the battlefield, telling his comrades, "Boys, I only did my duty. The old flag never touched the ground." Believe it or not, it would take 37 years, but 37 years later, William Harvey Carney was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1908 for his heroic service. Uh, he had retired from the post office. He delivered the mail after the Civil War for 30 years and was finally given his deserved honor, the Medal of Honor. So, kind of an interesting story about the first man. Now, women also underwent a huge change during the Civil War. You know, war seems to always make changes in what we consider roles of men and women. You know, obviously, at the beginning of the Civil War, even in the North, for the most part, when the women's role was, they were wives, they were mothers, they were housekeepers, they were home builders. They didn't work out very much. Well, during the Civil War, that began to change. Mainly, of course, obviously, because of the number of men that vacated and went to war, whether they wanted to or not. In the North, that was about half the men. About half the men were engaged at one time or the other in the Army in the Civil War. In the South, it was a whole lot bigger. It was one historian has estimated it was 84% of males were engaged in one time or the other in battle in the Civil War. That's hard for me to wrap my head around. I've read stories of where towards the end of the Civil War, they were drafting kids 13, 14, 15, and they were taking men who were working with canes fighting in the Civil War. It was that bad because they had lost so much manpower as a result of the battle. Well, with men gone, women took on roles. They became the farmers. They became the caretakers. They became merchants, with their husband and owned a hardware store and the husband went to work and there weren't any men. Guess who took over the store if they were going to keep it running? The wife, the daughters. So that's the kind of thing that changed. That happens every war. And every war we have seen in America, it kind of propels the women forward. And that's a good thing. Okay. Not that war is a good thing. And it's a shame that it has to be that, but it's a good thing that it did propel the women forward. Okay. So the role of women began to change. One of the biggest changes was the career of nursing. You may not believe this, but prior to the Civil War, almost all nurses were men. There were very few women nurses prior to the Civil War. You begin to see, again, women volunteering, taking care of wounded soldiers. Clara Barton, obviously, is the one that everybody goes to. Dorothea Dix, Ann Wittenmeyer. These all transformed the occupation of nursing, which up to this point had been pretty much a male-dominated vocation. It also affected the women's suffrage movement, which had begun prior to the Civil War, but had not really caught on. And it took a long time for the Civil War to for the suffrage movement to catch on. It would be another 60 years before the movement would reach its apex, where women all over the country were given the right to vote. Women in some states were given the right to vote much earlier. By the way, anybody know what state was the first state to grant the right to women to vote? Wyoming in the West. The Western states understood women's roles a lot faster than did the Eastern states because the women they were already taking care of business with the men, much more so than in the East. There was an estimated 400 women who actually donned the uniform to fight on the front lines during the Civil War. Obviously, they did this for different reasons. One of them was a lady by the name of Frances Clayton. She fought at Shiloh and Murfreesboro. It was not uncommon for women to accompany their soldier husbands to camp. We don't realize this. There were a lot of women that followed these armies. Not all of them good. there were the camp followers, and we won't go into that, but there were some not so nice women that followed the army. But there were a lot of women, wives, girlfriends that followed the army to help their husbands, boyfriends in their everyday life because they didn't fight all the time. A lot of the time was spent in camp. And so, this was not unusual. This is a picture of Frances Clayton. Actually, I think she's from Missouri, as I recall. And she actually fought, during the Civil War. I love this picture. Just what I just got done talking about. Look at this. Here's a Union soldier in camp with his wife and his daughters. Or I guess there may be a son there too. And they're in camp, and she's there. She's helping with the laundry. She's cooking, and you got soldiers looking off the background there, like wishing probably, gee, I wish my wife was here. This was the kind of thing that happened during the Civil War. We don't think about that, but that was not that unusual, folks. And of course, down here we have Clara Barton, who is the woman that's probably most associated in our minds in the United States with the nursing corps. So let's kind of look at Clara Barton. She's an important person. Clara Barton was born in 1821 in Massachusetts. Her father was a military man, and so he had instilled in her the spirit of patriotism and service. That was the big thing to him. Problem was, she was kind of a timid child. She was, I don't want to use the word fragile, but from what I've been able to read, she was kind of, she wasn't real strong. And I don't mean that physically. I'm talking about emotionally. She was pretty much a timid child. She had helped nurse relatives and somewhat had overcome her shyness as a teacher. As she became a teacher and she kind of overcome that. I understand that. You may not believe this, but I was an extremely shy, introverted person before I began teaching. And I figured out real fast if I was going to teach, I was going to have to change because you can't do that in the classroom. You can't be timid and introverted. You have to overcome it, because you're on the stage almost like an actor or an actress. Well, she overcame to some degree her timidness. She decided she was going to go back to college because back in those days, you didn't necessarily have to have a college education to teach. All you had to do was take a test and they could determine whether or not you had enough knowledge more than your students and you could teach then. Well, she decided she wanted to go back to school and her old timidness and nervousness, and she kind of had what was called a nervous breakdown. She really broke down. She eventually recovered and the war broke out and she moved to Washington, D.C. to work in the patent office. Well, Washington, D.C. was a hotbed of hospitalization. They would bring wounded soldiers back, and there were just hospitals all over Washington, D.C. And so, like a lot of women, she began volunteering, helping the soldiers. She didn't go there to be a nurse in the beginning. She went there to help and just volunteer because she had this spirit of humanitarianism and patriotism that her father had instilled in her. Well, as it turned out, she was really, really, really good at it. And she was so empathetic that people began to ask for her. In fact, the case eventually she came to be anointed the lady in charge of hospitals, and she was called the angel of the battlefield. Soldiers, her name just becomes synonymous with nursing at this point. At the end of the war, she was put in charge of helping identify soldiers that were killed or MIA, which was a big deal, folks, because there were thousands of soldiers that had been killed or were missing and could not be identified or were missing in action. And she kind of helped with this. And then she went to the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 overseas, where she met up with Florence Nightingale and some of these, ladies that we associate with nursing, came back home and founded the American Red Cross. And so she is typically, she is seen as the founder of the American Red Cross. Died in 1912 at the age of, I've got it blocked out, the age of 90. The age of 90. Terrific woman, folks. Terrific story. This country owes such a debt of gratitude to her and all those people that nurse, for sure. My wife, was a nurse's aide for 40 years, and I guarantee you, I understand how much these people gave to their patients. Well, the rise of the Republican Party. Remember, prior to the Civil War, there were two parties primarily in this country, or had been. In the beginning, there were the Federalists, and then these Federalists were replaced by the Democratic Republicans. And then when Andrew Jackson came in, he basically changed it to the Democratic Party. That had been the dominant party, political party in America, clear up to the beginning of the Civil War. Now, the Whig Party had been there, and they had actually elected a couple of presidents, but remember, they both died very early in office, so they couldn't get their feet on the ground. As it turned out, the Whig Party just couldn't get it together, and so by 1856, a brand new party had been formed, the Republican Party, and it kind of rose out of the ashes of the old Whig Party. The primary agenda of this new Republican Party was to oppose the expansion of slavery into Western territory. It was not at that point totally abolitionist. At this point, it was primarily trying to make sure that slavery didn't expand. That's where Abraham Lincoln was. He was a Whig, and then he switched to the Republican Party. It was also a party that supported entrepreneurship, investments in industry, railroads, banking, primarily made up of Protestants, factory workers, professionals, businessmen, uh, better farmers, prosperous farmers. It was kind of the party of the more well off to do, the middle class and the well off, as opposed to the Democrats. The Democrats had kind of coalesced into basically the strident party, the old party that were primarily for the downtrodden, and had become an extremely anti-black party, and had become very much kind of pro-slavery. The Republican Party, of course, challenged the Democratic Party in 1856 for the first time. They ran old John C. Fremont, who was absolutely not a good presidential candidate. He came real close to winning the election. Nobody expected that. James Buchanan was a Democrat, and Fremont actually came a lot closer to winning than people thought he was going to. He actually may have won had there not been a third party. Former President Millard Fillmore was running on what was called the American Party, the Know Nothings, it was a nativist party. It was a party that was against immigration, totally. Well, Buchanan ends up winning, but Fremont does a lot better than expected. So the next election, and we've already talked about this, you saw Abraham Lincoln running against three other candidates, and he wins even though he is a minority president, even though he only gets like 40% of the vote. Yeah. But that would establish the Republican Party as the majority political party for the next 70 years. In fact, between the Civil War and the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was only two Democratic presidents, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. That was it, folks. The Democratic Party just, was, I won't say it was in a wasteland because it wasn't. It was still a party that was very strong in the states and all, but it definitely was not a national party in the same way that we think of it today. It was primarily, in the old South as such. So here's a campaign thing from the 1856 election. So the Civil War kind of brings about the advent of the Republican Party, another big revolution. Now, obviously, there was dissension amongst the Democrats and the Republicans, primarily the Democrats. In the South, obviously, everybody was Democrat. I have read that there were some states in the South where Lincoln did not receive a single vote in the 1860 election. I find that a little hard to believe. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just, I know that there were places, certain counties and cities and towns and villages where nobody voted for Lincoln. But I've read actually where there were some states, and I'm not sure which ones right now, maybe Mississippi. I may be wrong on that. So Don't hold me to that. But I do know that it was overwhelmingly a Southern party at that point and would remain so for quite some time. And obviously now that has totally changed. Um, there were pockets of resistance, uh, parts of Louisiana, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina. There was some dissension with the Democratic Party, which were still, you know, uh, pretty much hold sway in the border states in the South. Even the Democrats in the North were split. On one hand, you had what were called war Democrats. They were anti slavery, but they were pro union. A lot of these were immigrant German and Irish people uh, who absolutely despised slavery because, frankly, where they had come from, they were virtual slaves themselves. And when they got to America, that was the last thing they wanted was to see slavery. And so a lot of the German and the Irish, they were Democrats, but they also were supportive of the Union. And then you had the Copperheads. These were really the dissidents in the Democratic Party in the North. They were pro-union, but they were anti-war, anti-draft, sympathetic to slavery. I'm not going to sit here and say they were pro-slavery, but I'm sure there were some. But they were definitely sympathetic to letting it stay where it was. By the way, the reason they were called Copperheads was because when they began to be organizing as groups, the Republicans derisively said they were a bunch of venomous snakes. And somebody said, yeah, they're like copperheads. Well, as so often happens, when you start labeling somebody with a derisive label, they sometimes take that label and switch it up on you. In this case, the copperheads started taking the copper pennies, which had an emblem of Lady Liberty on it, and cutting Lady Liberty out and making brooches and pins and wearing them on their lapels to show people, yeah, I'm a copperhead, and they took it as a thing of pride. The leader of the Copperheads was a man from Ohio who became a House member, and I think he was then a senator. A man was named Clement Bland. Oh boy, here we go. Vallandigham. I don't know if I'm saying that right or not. In May of 1863, Vallandigham was arrested on the orders of General Burnside for sympathizing with the enemy. Remember Burnside? He's the guy that took over from McClellan and lost terribly at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And Lincoln decided he couldn't keep him around, but he wasn't a bad guy, so he sent him west, thinking, I'll get him out west where he won't cause trouble. Well, guess what? He caused a lot of trouble. And this was where he caused the trouble. He arrested Vallandigham for sympathizing with the enemy, even though that was not necessarily a crime. He tried him in a military court, which convicted him and sent him to a military prison. They made a martyr out of him. And here was Lincoln, who was trying to keep the North together. And all of a sudden, you've got this guy that's becoming a martyr to the cause of the Copperheads. And so he decided, I got to do something with this guy. I got to get rid of him, or he's going to absolutely destroy what I'm trying to do out in Kentucky and Missouri and southern parts of Ohio and all. So he releases him from prison, takes him to the battle lines, and expels him to the Confederates. Said, here, you guys take him. We don't want him. You can have him. Confederates didn't know what to do with him. He was, sympathetic to slavery, but he was also pro-union. So they basically ship him out to Canada, where he stayed. He actually runs for the governorship of Ohio in absentia while he's in Canada. Doesn't win. He's defeated. And at that point, he's kind of lost his mojo. And so Lincoln wisely decided to just let him kind of slip back into the United States. And he got so strident in his views that people thought this guy's a nutcase. And as a result, they just kind of started not even listening to him. Lincoln did the wise thing. Sometimes you're better off to ignore these people than to make martyrs out of them. And that's exactly what had happened to Vallandigham. He wasn't that big a deal until Burnside made a big deal out of him. And then Lincoln wisely decided to kind of defray the whole thing. So here's a kind of a cartoon about the Copperheads. That's Representative Clement Vallandigham. I don't know if I'm saying his name right or not. Okay. So one last thing, and we're going to stop. The economy of the North. At the beginning of the war, the North had embraced the Industrial Revolution. It had already embraced it, but it really embraced it after the Civil War began. And it transformed into a commercial and manufacturing giant compared to the South. Look at this. Look at these statistics, folks. In 1860, 90% of the nation's manufacturing output came from the North. 90%. The northern states produced 17 times more cotton and wool and textile. They didn't produce the wool necessarily or the cotton, but they took it and made the textiles out of it. And that was a huge thing. 30 times more leather goods, 20 times more pig iron, 32 times more firearms than the southern states. I mean, compared to the South, the North was just an overwhelming industrial machine. Railroads, weapons, productions. By 1860, only 40% of the population of the northern states were involved in agriculture. It had become, more than half of the people were now involved in manufacturing and commercial pursuits instead of agriculture. In the South, they were still 84%. 84% of the people in the South were living on farms. Those in the North who were still farming were becoming increasingly mechanized with things like mechanical harvesters, reapers, corn pickers, steam-powered engines, tractors. They absolutely revolutionized agriculture. But in the South, it just didn't go because the South hung on to this old Southern mentality of slave people working, the ground. All this resulted in a much more urbanized North, which attracted by far and away most of the immigrants that came to the United States. Immigrants in the United States overwhelmingly settled in the North compared to the South, 80%. As a result, the population of the Union States had soared over 23 million in 1860, compared to the Confederacy, which only had 9 million. 40% of those were slaves. So just do the figures in your head real fast, folks. When you're killing 20,000 people in a battle, and maybe it's 10,000 Northerners and 10,000 Southerners, the Northerners had a lot of more people to replace them than the South did. And by the end of the Civil War, the South had run out of bodies. That's just literally the case. I mean, they literally were running out of bodies. The Southern economy just absolutely lagged in industrialization. It's not because there wasn't industrial economic advantages. There was a lot of wealth in the South, but it was dependent upon slaves. In 1860, the economic value of slaves exceeded all the wealth of the nation's railroads, factories, and banks in the whole country combined. Slaves were expensive. If you wanted to buy a slave, you had to have some money, folks. And I mean, this was, thousands of dollars for some slaves, particularly a strong young male. On the eve of the war, cotton prices were at an all-time high. The South produced 2/3 of the world's cotton, at the beginning of the Civil War. However, there was a great inequity in the distribution of wealth. Most of the wealth in the South was in the hands of the few. Most of the farmers and most of the small shop owners in the South didn't have all this money. 84% of the South's population was still involved in agriculture, which was very labor intensive, so very little industrial manufacturing output. At the beginning of the war, the South only had 29% of the nation's railroads and 13% of the nation's banks. So I hope you're getting the picture. The North was a lot more industrial, had a lot more resources than did the South. During the Civil War, this only worsened, okay? As the war began to be fought, and it was fought almost entirely in southern states. There were a few instances where they got up in the North, but only on the edge of the North. For the most part, the war was fought in the South. And the Union Army, particularly towards the end of the war, just absolutely destroyed anything in their way. They went out of the way to make sure that railroad lines were tore up, businesses were burned down, farms were gutted, animals were slaughtered. They went the whole concept of total war, which we'll talk about later. So the Southern economy really fell apart during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, it was in shreds, as we'll talk about later. So that's it for today. Like I said, I wanted to do something different today. I wanted to talk a little bit about what was going on in the Civil War. And we're going to continue that next week because we're going to begin looking at some of the important advances that the Congress is making, like the land grant colleges, the railroad acts, building the railroads, some things like that. And then we'll kind of see what happened during the first part of 1863 in the war, which was primarily centered in the West at this point. So that's it for today. I hope you've learned something today. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, I always tell you, keep on, doing that lifelong learning. Try to keep that mind going. Try to keep that old noggin, alive, because if you don't, it'll lie on you. I can guarantee you. So we will see you next week. Hope you have a good week and enjoy this wonderful weather. I think it's pretty nice in Springfield, as I recall seeing it. So we'll let you go then. Bye-bye.